We should be ashamed to take somebody in the front line, because that war does not concern us Africans at all, at all.
Families and survivors say they were duped into fighting for Russia in its war on Ukraine as it drags on for a fifth year. Kiev says nearly 1,800 Africans from 36 countries were promised lucrative jobs only to be sent to the front line with minimal training. Nearly 325,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since 2022, while Ukraine has lost up to 140,000 of its troops. That's according to data by Washington-based think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies. But both Russians and Ukrainians claim they've suffered far lower fatalities. And as they lose more men than they can recruit, some Africans on social media platforms say they've found themselves in the front line.
As you can see that I'm wearing a Russian uniform right now. It happened, I can say it's a mistake, but it might be a life lesson and maybe might be helpful to others. Russia will keep on recruiting people from Africa, and not only Africa, but to the rest of the world. But the fact about there is that he lied about huge amount of money, like 1 million rubles, but unfortunately that million rubles will not get anything to your account.
Now, in February, an investigation released by Impact and All Eyes on Wagner found that more than 1,400 Africans have been recruited to fight for Russia in Ukraine since 2023. They were between 18 and 57 years old, and they signed formal contracts to enlist. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry says the numbers are much higher, even though Russia hasn't published their own data.
Russia is trying to drag citizens and residents of Africa into death and war. According to our data, more than 1,780 citizens from the African continent are currently fighting in the Russian army. We're talking about mercenaries. Many of them are dying and have already died. We've already captured quite a few of them. In total, according to our data, representatives from 36 African countries are participating in hostilities on the side of Russia.
It is not something what is publicly discussed, and I do not believe we would find a confirmation of this information. But at the same time, I understand those things might happen, and some people from different countries, they would be willing to fight on a contract form, or like I said, to get an experience. So it could be, and also we understand that Russia is also providing certain, I would say, influence, because when you teach the fighters, recruiters from different countries, you also somehow impose your own influence.
But data by Kenya's intelligence service shows that more than 1,000 Kenyans have been recruited to fight for Russia in the Ukraine war. It reveals they were promised lucrative jobs with a monthly salary of about $2,700 plus hefty bonuses of about $9,300, as well as Russian citizenship. Now, the government says it plans to shut down an estimated 600 recruiting agencies and send the country's foreign minister to Moscow to curb the recruitment.
The government authorities of Russia have never engaged in illegal recruitment of Kenyan citizens in the armed forces of the Russian Federation. However, it must be understood that the legislation of the Russian Federation does not preclude citizens of foreign countries from voluntarily enlisting in the armed forces of the Russian Federation.
In South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa says 17 South African men sent out distress calls for help returning from Russia. At least 3 people are being investigated in connection with their recruitment, including Duduzile Zuma Sambudla, the daughter of former South African President Jacob Zuma. She denies any wrongdoing, but their families say they were tricked.
I was angry, to be honest. I was afraid that we might lose him, because now we speak about war. People die, you know. Even innocent people die. Even the soldiers die in the war. What about him? He's not a soldier. He's just a guy who wanted a better life for him and his children.
And more African countries like Nigeria have warned against increasing illegal recruitment of its citizens to fight in foreign conflicts. The Gambia has also raised concern over citizens traveling abroad to join ongoing armed conflicts, while Egypt has restricted travel to Russia and Ukraine. Ghana is calling on Kiev to release its citizens captured while fighting for Moscow.
They were just lured and then deceived and put on the front lines in the battlefield. And it is important to emphasize that their actions, regrettable, unfortunate, they should be seen as victims. They are not engaged in any sanctioned activity. And we want to make that very clear, and we want the media to really put that across.
All right, let's hear more from Hassan Kanedre. He's the director of Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. He joins me from Nairobi. Thank you so much, Hassan, for joining us. I mean, just straight on, just why are Africans being drawn into Russia's war on Ukraine?
There are a number of reasons why Africans are finding themselves in the conflict theater between Russia and Ukraine. One is false advertising. Many of these, mostly young men, are being sold the idea they're going to get fairly good jobs, normal jobs, only to end up with recruitment agencies actually using private companies that are getting the military. Second, that those are being driven by the fact that either they're unemployed or they're underemployed in their countries of origin. And so they see an opportunity to be able to make quick money, take care of their families back home, which is a dream of every African young man and woman. But thirdly, there is also peer pressure. While there's been reports about the horrific deaths in the front line, there's still content online actually glorifying the kind of benefits coming from those kind of engagements. And so peer pressure is also contributing to this kind of engagement that is pushing mainly fairly desperate and sometimes idealistic African youth into getting into a conflict theater of Russia and Ukraine.
Right, and we've had Kenya say, and actually you're from Nairobi, you're joining us from Nairobi now, because Kenya is saying that it plans to shut down an estimated 600 recruiting agencies. The question then would be, will shutting down these agencies help? You've talked about peer pressure, you've talked about the false advertising, you've talked about the unemployment problem, which Kenya is also facing, for instance. So will shutting down these agencies help? And just what more should African governments do to just curb all this?
No, shutting down is going to reduce and slow down the degree of recruitment. However, it's not going to completely prevent recruitment. Remember, it is important to understand that some of these recruitment agencies are actually based outside Kenya and outside Africa continent. For instance, you have Africans who are working in the Gulf that are being recruited directly from the Gulf countries. But it's also important to remember that some of these recruitment agencies are part of a network of international organized criminal networks. And they have extensive reach, they have extensive experience in trying to do underground work. And so they're going to continue doing that. Now, what more can African countries, for instance, do to prevent that? In terms of practical actions, they, apart from perhaps introducing laws that ban travel into certain countries, which is going to probably be unpopular and probably unconstitutional with many African countries, they can do what I call sensitization in terms to underscore the dangers, of course, inherent in this. But still, we're still going to have Africans who are actually going still to try their luck out there, in part just because of sometimes the desperation, especially as a result of limited opportunities prevalent to the continent.
You've mentioned travel restrictions, and I'm just thinking how that would affect relationships between these countries and Russia, before we even talk about how present relations have been affected by the recruits, the alleged recruits that we're seeing. How would that affect these relations?
Of course, if you move towards restrictions, that is going to have diplomatic consequences, between the countries, and so you may likely have tit for tat in the process. Of course, then leading to a situation that perhaps is not exactly pleasant. However, there are other forms of restrictions with regard to the agencies. Or the qualifications of those who are actually going to ensure that the end product, or at least the end point, is clearly defined and known, so that the false advertising is not, is not used as one of them. But fundamentally, there isn't much per se that African countries can do, especially within the context of free movement of people and goods, and within the context of democracies, where you're not supposed to ban citizens from actually being able to visit another country unless that other country is an enemy state. It's not a friendly state to US. And so, considering the kind of relations that African countries already have with the Russian Federation as well as Ukraine, it is hard to see African countries taking such dramatic actions that is going to destroy relations that already exist between these two countries.
How about the current situation? Have we seen any diplomatic relations being affected? I'm asking because, again, case in point, Kenya. Kenya says more than 1,000 Kenyans have been lured to this fight. The Russian embassy in Kenya denies this. It says it's never been involved in any of such recruitments. Have we seen these relationships again being affected?
No, there is no fundamental impact on the relations between Kenya and the Russian Federation. And it is plausible to probably say, agree with the statement coming from the Russian embassy, in part because a lot of recruitment is also being done in third countries, actually. And so they don't really have to be recruited directly, through the Kenyan embassy in Kenya. However, the substantive aspects of the Kenya-Russia relations as well as other African-Russia relations have not been affected. Yes, granted, there's been some tensions with regard to some of those issues, considering the numbers that have been recruited, but also the casualty numbers that are coming out of the conflict theater. But fundamentally, I expect that the relations are going to remain much less the same as they were before this kind of discussion.
When you say you in part agree with the Russian embassy in Kenya, the question then would be who bears responsibility for all of this? We've heard from the Ghanaian minister there saying that these people should be looked at as victims. So who shoulders the responsibility for them?
The challenge, especially with the recruitment agencies, is there's an element of plausible deniability on the side of governments. Because government will say we've not directly been involved in recruiting, but military companies out there that are private military companies, so they are known to get involved in recruitment. And so the tactics they employ still offers government a plausible deniability. Now, ultimately, who is responsible for this? This is something that I think from bilateral as well as perhaps multilateral dimensions can be discussed between the Russian Federation as well as the Ukraine and African countries to ensure that they can limit the degree of engagement of their own citizens into the conflict theater. Outside that, there isn't really much in terms of who are you going to blame, considering that most of these people are adults and some of them may be making this decision willingly.
All right. And lastly, let's look at this whole issue more broadly. Just what has been the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine, which has now entered the fifth year? What's been that impact on the African continent in general?
The impact of the continent was actually big, especially in the past 2 years of the conflict. Why? Because the Russian Federation and Ukraine, they supplied most of the wheat that the continent was consuming for the better part of the last 30, 40 years. And so in terms of food security, something that was affected, as well as the fertilizer, which of course then affected agricultural production. But also in terms of arms, supply, the continent had relied quite a bit on arms coming from that part of the world. In executing its own security as well as taking care of its domestic security needs. Now, while that has been affected in certain serious ways, in recent months, what we have seen is the continent has also increasingly become a theater for global geopolitics that are emanating from the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And so you see the activities not just in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, but elsewhere that are actually a manifestation of what is happening in Europe. And so while the continent may be very far away from the conflict theater, it's not been spared the impact of the conflict dynamics in Europe.
All right, Hassan Kaneju, the director of Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for your time and your contribution. Speaking of learning, space exploration and STEM education has been gaining global attention, and Kenyan innovators are capturing young minds using interactive experiences from far-off galaxies with rocket models. Instead of textbooks and classrooms, children are engaging with exhibits and demonstrations at Nairobi's Mbinguni Cosmic Park, as Victoria Amunga reports.
Yeah, so what did you say a rocket was?
For over 3 years, Eugene Awimbo has been turning his space dreams into a universe of experiential learning for Nairobi children.
It makes this tangible for them. They are real models they can actually come and see interact with, touch, ask questions about, learn about, and learn from. For instance, of us, and so from there they can develop the interest of scaling this thing up, and in future they can be very important players in the aerospace industries in Africa.
Safety off. Fire!
Through simulations of space missions and hands-on demonstrations with rocket duplicates, learners like 10-year-old Arnold Ochieng can begin to grasp complex concepts like space exploration and astrophysics.
I like engineering, that's why I'm learning this, and in the future I want to go to space.
A 2025 study by Space in Africa shows that while economic constraints remain a big challenge, African governments allocated more than $400 million on space programs last year alone.
Innovations like space parks are making science, especially space science, much more appealing to children. Not only are they having fun, they're learning loads more. It might just convince some children that their potential goes to infinity and beyond.
So what happens is,
so far, the initiative has reached about 3,000 learners from 15 different schools. Kenya established its own space agency in 2017 to coordinate the country's cosmic ambitions, roll out mentorship programs through space clubs initiatives, and develop future space professionals.
So we send teams out on outreach, specifically where schools, and we target to leverage on opportunities where schools are gathered around science-themed events, or like Young Science or Young Scientist Kenya, Annual Science Congress, or even opportunities where schools are gathered for STEM-related events.
2, 1, ignition.
Kenya has so far developed and launched 2 satellites, but as the country's space ambitions advance, pioneers like Awimbo believe that initiatives like Binguni Cosmic Park will ensure no child is left behind. Victoria Amunga, Africa Matters, Kajiado, Kenya.
Staying in Kenya, where the country has almost doubled access to primary education over the past 2 decades, from 5.9 million to over 10 million students, with enrollment now outpacing population growth. But this surge has left many children with disabilities behind. Although just over 11% of Kenyan children have special needs, only about 250,000 are enrolled in school, according to the non-profit So They Can. But one unorthodox school is emerging as a potential model for closing that gap. Yunus Demiroglu has more.
Just another day of school for these Kenyan students. But Rare Gem Talent School is not your typical institution. And this classroom is for children with dyslexia or other learning challenges.
In teaching reading, we usually use structured literacy, which is a systematic way of teaching. You teach step by step until the learner gets what you are teaching. Not a lecture method where the teacher stands in front and starts explaining. Here we usually do individualized learning.
In traditional classrooms, the learning pace is usually determined by the slowest learner. But around 10% of pupils in the world are affected by dyslexia. That's according to the British Dyslexia Association. Here, each of the 200 students learn at their own pace. That does come with its own challenges.
You find that some learners with the dyslexia, they can reach a point where breaking through in reading is so difficult. So as a teacher, you have to find many other methods to support the learning.
Educators say children with dyslexia may mix up letters like B and P, or even the number 9. Phyllis Muni says she started Rare Gem in 2012, after her dyslexic son's challenges went unaddressed.
If they are identified early and intervention are given early, they improve their skills, they actually learn to identify their talents, and they complete school.
Something that Joffrey Karani, an art teacher and former student here, agrees with.
In other normal schools, there's a lot of discrimination, there's a lot of bullying, because you can imagine yourself seated in a class whereby there are 50 students and you're the only slow learner there who is not performing, who is not reading, who is not writing. So there's a lot of things going on at the same time. And coming to this school, all of that changed.
Rare Gem's multi-method and multi-sensory methods of teaching shows education isn't just limited to pen and paper, and that there's no way around embracing your challenges, but that there's more than one way to deal with them. Yunus Demiroğlu, Africa Matters.
To Gabon now, where a nationwide suspension of social media has been in place for more than a week. Platforms like Facebook and TikTok are inaccessible in the Central African country of about 2.5 million people. As Rahul Radhakrishnan reports, the move has angered many, even as the government stands by it.
An unexpected announcement. Social media platforms in Gabon suspended until further notice.
The High Authority for Communication notes the repeated dissemination on social media and digital platforms accessible within Gabonese territory of inappropriate, defamatory, hateful and insulting content that undermines human dignity, public morality, the honor of citizens, social cohesion, the stability of the institutions of the Republic and national security.
In mid-February, the country's media regulators said online content was fueling division and threatening public order. Since December, Gabon has seen several nationwide strikes and protests over pay and working conditions in the health, education, and broadcasting sectors. President Brice Oligui Nguema, who took office last year, has backed the regulator's decision.
With this decision, Gabon is sending a strong signal to highlight the need for this debate. And of course, this is a suspension and not a permanent ban, to give us time to consider, legislating and providing more guidance on the issue in order to preserve, once again, our ability to live together, and ultimately, to preserve the interest that Gabonese people have in accessing information that is verified and accurate.
But opposition figures say the suspension creates a climate of fear under the new leadership.
This decision is completely absurd because these days many businesses, SMEs, young entrepreneurs survive solely thanks to social media. It's not at all some kind of gimmick for having fun anymore. It's really a work tool, and for a country facing economic difficulties, it's truly counterproductive.
The impact is already being felt by people who make their living online.
This is the direct consequence. Firstly, as a creator, even in Gabon, we already struggle with monetizing social networks. So it's contracts that allow us to exist. So I can't even work or honor what was agreed with them.
The government says it's about national security. Critics say it's about control. As the blackout continues, millions in Gabon are offline. But the debate over security and freedom is only growing louder. Rahul Radhakrishnan, Africa Matters.
We head back to Sudan, where not only schools have been devastated by war, but the environment as well. Millions of people have been displaced, entire forests have been wiped out. Among them is what was once a vast acacia sanctuary south of Khartoum, as Kubra Akkoch reports.
This is what is left of the Sunut forest in Khartoum. The 15 square kilometer forest once stood along the Nile, providing shade, a wildlife habitat and protection from floods. But today, it's been largely razed.
The war has had a significant impact on the forests, especially the acacia forest in Khartoum, which has been the scene of intense and excessive logging.
Some trees, which were 100 years old, were cut down for charcoal and timber. Authorities say Khartoum state has lost around 60% of its forest cover. That was home to more than 100 bird species, including the migratory ones from Europe. It also helped protect the Sudanese capital.
If the floodwaters arrive in such large quantities and with the same force, without any barriers or measures to mitigate their impact, it will affect the surrounding area, because the forest served as a bulwark against the danger of flooding.
Wild animals have also disappeared. Monkeys and small mammals that once lived here have been displaced. And for many, the forest was more than just trees.
The acacia forest was a place of recreation for us, and we used to come in groups to study and have a good time. It was also a source of income for some people.
Experts warn that restoring a forest this old could take a lot of time and money. Kubra Akkoch, Africa Matters.
That's our show this week. Let us know what you think about Africans lured to fight abroad and what can be done. You can leave your comments on our Africa Matters YouTube page or on X. Thanks for watching, and it's goodbye from me, Grace Korea Kanja.